Thomas Bennett stood at the top of the ski slope in Aspen, Colorado, feeling like he owned the world. At 45 years old, he had everything money could buy: a successful tech company worth billions, a luxury penthouse in Manhattan, and the freedom to do whatever he wanted. The crisp winter morning made him feel alive, and the fresh powder snow beckoned him to make his mark. Just one more run before the meeting, he said to himself, checking his expensive watch. In 3 hours, he needed to be on a video call with his company's board of directors. But right now, the mountain was calling him. The ski instructor had warned him about the dangerous conditions that morning. "The snow is too fresh, Mr. Bennett. Maybe wait until afternoon." But Thomas wasn't used to people telling him no. Success had made him believe he was invincible. As he pushed off from the top, the cold wind whipped against his face. The slope was empty, just how he liked it. No amateur skiers getting in his way. The first few minutes were perfect. Thomas carved through the snow with the skill of someone who had been skiing since childhood. Then everything went wrong. A hidden patch of ice appeared out of nowhere. Thomas tried to adjust, but he was going too fast. His skis crossed, and suddenly he was airborne. Time seemed to slow down as he flew through the air. The last thing he saw was a large pine tree getting closer and closer. The impact changed his life forever. When Thomas woke up 3 days later in the hospital, he couldn't feel his legs. The doctors spoke to him in gentle voices, using words like spinal cord injury and paralysis. They told him he was lucky to be alive, but Thomas didn't feel lucky. How could he run his company from a hospital bed? "Mr. Bennett, with proper rehabilitation, you can still live a full life," the doctor explained, adjusting his charts. "Many people with similar injuries go on to." "I'm not many people," Thomas snapped. "I'm Thomas Bennett. I have a company to run." The next few months were the hardest of his life. Rehabilitation was painful and humiliating for someone who had always been in control. Simple tasks like getting dressed or moving from his bed to a wheelchair became major challenges. Thomas hated depending on others for help. His sister Sarah visited him every day at the rehabilitation center. She watched with worry as her once confident brother became bitter and withdrawn. The nurses tried their best, but Thomas was a difficult patient, often yelling at them when things didn't go his way. Finally, after 4 months, Thomas returned to his penthouse. The place had been modified with ramps and special equipment, but it felt different now. Empty. Cold. His huge floor-to-ceiling windows that once showed him the city he had conquered now made him feel like a prisoner watching life go by. Sarah came to visit one evening, finding Thomas staring out at the New York skyline from his wheelchair. Empty take-up containers littered the coffee table. He had been refusing to let anyone cook for him. "This can't go on, Thomas," Sarah said softly, clearing away the mess. "You need help." "I have help," he replied bitterly. "Nurses come in twice a day." Sarah shook her head. "No, you need someone full-time. Someone who can live here and help you get your life back on track. A professional caregiver." "I don't want a stranger in my home," Thomas protested, but his voice was tired. Even he could see that things weren't working. "I'll help you find someone good," Sarah promised. "We'll do background checks, interviews, whatever you need. But you can't keep living like this. Your company needs you. And more importantly, you need to start living again." Thomas didn't respond, but Sarah could see him thinking about it. She knew her brother. Beneath his angry exterior, he was scared. Scared of depending on others, scared of showing weakness, scared of what his life had become. That night, after Sarah left, Thomas sat in the darkness of his penthouse. His laptop glowed with hundreds of unread emails from his company. Before the accident, he would have answered them all immediately. Now, he barely had the energy to care. As he looked out at the city lights, Thomas realized Sarah was right. Something had to change. He couldn't keep going like this. Tomorrow, he would tell her to start looking for a caregiver. He didn't know it yet, but this decision would change his life in ways he could never imagine. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas agreed to hire a full-time caregiver. Sarah had arranged interviews with 12 candidates, but none of them seemed right. Some were intimidated by Thomas's wealth, others by his harsh attitude. A few were clearly more interested in his money than the job. "Last one for today," Sarah announced, walking into Thomas's study. She looked tired from managing the interviews all day. "Her name is Grace Mwangi. She's from Kenya, and her references are excellent." Thomas sighed from his wheelchair. "Another one?" What's the point? But before he could protest further, there was a gentle knock at the door. The woman who entered wasn't what Thomas expected. Grace Mwangi was in her late 30s, dressed simply but professionally in a blue blouse and black skirt. She carried herself with quiet confidence, and her warm smile reached her eyes behind silver-framed glasses. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bennett," she said in clear English with a slight accent. "Thank you for considering me for this position." Thomas noticed something different about her immediately. Unlike the other candidates, she didn't look at him with pity. She met his eyes directly, professionally, but she was at a business meeting rather than a caregiver interview. "Your resume says you were a doctor in Kenya," Thomas said, getting straight to the point. "Why would you want to be a caregiver?" Grace sat down when Sarah offered her a chair. "Yes, I practiced medicine for 12 years in Nairobi. When I came to America 2 years ago, my medical license wasn't recognized here. The process to get certified is very expensive and takes time." She paused, then added, "But caring for people isn't just about titles, Mr. Bennett. Sometimes it's about being where you're needed." Thomas raised an eyebrow. Most candidates had tried to impress him with their experience or charm. Grace simply stated facts. "The job requires living here full-time," Sarah explained. "You'd have your own room and bathroom, of course, but you'd need to be available most days and nights." Grace nodded. "I understand. I've worked as a live-in caregiver before, for an elderly couple in Boston. I can provide references." Thomas wheeled himself closer to her. "What makes you think you can handle me? I'm not an easy person to work with. Ask anyone." For the first time, Grace smiled fully. "Mr. Bennett, I've handled emergency rooms during political riots. I've treated difficult patients in impossible conditions. I'm not easily intimidated." Something about her calm confidence irritated and intrigued Thomas at the same time. "What about your family? Won't they mind you living here?" "My daughter is in college in Kenya on scholarship. My parents passed away years ago. I came to America to build a better life, and I'm not afraid of hard work." The interview continued for another hour. Grace answered every question directly and professionally. She demonstrated her knowledge of medical care, discussed her experience with physical therapy, and showed she had done research on spinal cord injuries. When Grace left, Sarah turned to her brother with hope in her eyes. "Well, what do you think?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "There's something familiar about her. I can't place it. But what did you think of her qualifications?" "She's overqualified," Thomas said flatly. "She should be practicing medicine, not babysitting me." Sarah sighed. "That's not what I asked, Thomas. Did you feel comfortable with her?" Thomas thought about it. Unlike the other candidates, Grace hadn't tried to flatter him or pretend his condition wasn't serious. She had been honest, direct, and somehow both professional and warm at the same time. "Call her references," he finally said. "If they check out, offer her the job." 3 days later, Grace moved into the penthouse. She arrived with 2 small suitcases and a box of medical books. As she settled into her room, Thomas watched her from his study doorway. She moved with purpose, organizing her things efficiently. When she noticed him watching, she simply smiled and said, "I'll start tomorrow at 7 a.m., Mr. Bennett. Please let me know if you need anything before then." Thomas wheeled himself back to his room, still trying to shake the feeling that he had seen Grace somewhere before. Little did he know, their connection went back much further than either of them realized. A month had passed since Grace started working as Thomas's caregiver, and life in the penthouse had changed dramatically. Each morning at exactly 7 a.m., Grace would knock on Thomas's door, ready to start their daily routine. At first, Thomas had resisted her help, but Grace's quiet determination slowly broke down his walls. "Mr. Bennett, it's time for your exercises," Grace said one morning, wheeling in the physical therapy equipment. She always wore her silver-framed glasses, which she would adjust whenever she was concentrating. That simple gesture, the way she pushed her glasses up with her index finger, kept triggering something in Thomas's memory. It was like trying to remember a word that was on the tip of his tongue, frustrating and constant. "You know," Thomas said, as Grace helped him with his stretches, "I still can't shake the feeling that I've met you before." Grace smiled her usual calm smile. "New York is a big city, Mr. Bennett. Perhaps we cross paths somewhere?" But Thomas shook his head. "No, it's from before. Way before." He winced as she helped him bend his leg. The physical therapy was always painful, but Grace knew exactly how far to push him. Unlike the nurses at the rehabilitation center, Grace had a way of making him work harder without feeling like he was being forced. She would tell him stories about her time in Kenya while they exercised, distracting him from the pain. "Today, you're going to try something new," Grace announced after their morning routine. She brought in a laptop and set it up on his wheelchair tray. "It's time you started working again." Thomas stared at the computer. He hadn't touched it since the accident, too afraid of facing his company's problems. "I don't think." "Your sister tells me you built your company from nothing," Grace interrupted, adjusting her glasses again. "The Thomas Bennett I've read about wouldn't let anything stop him, not even this." There it was again, that familiar gesture with her glasses, followed by that determined look. It reminded him of someone, but who? Over the next few hours, Grace sat with him as he caught up on company emails. She brought him coffee just the way he liked it, black with 1 sugar, and reminded him to take breaks when he got too tense. During lunch, Thomas watched as Grace prepared their meals in the kitchen. She moved with the same efficiency she showed in everything else, but there was something almost medical about her precision. "Where did you work in Kenya?" he asked suddenly. "I started at a small clinic outside Nairobi," she replied, chopping vegetables. "It was a wonderful place, built by volunteers. That's where I learned to be a doctor." Thomas felt a strange tingle in his spine that had nothing to do with his injury. A clinic outside Nairobi? Why did that sound important? That night, unable to sleep, Thomas asked Grace to bring him his old storage boxes from the study. "The ones marked 2004, he specified. "At this hour?" Grace asked, surprised. It was almost midnight. "Please," Thomas said. "I need to check something." Grace brought the boxes, and Thomas started going through old papers and photographs. His hands moved faster as he searched, driven by a feeling he couldn't explain. "What are you looking for?" Grace asked, stifling a yawn. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I'll know when I find it." As Grace turned to leave, she adjusted her glasses one more time, and suddenly it hit Thomas. He remembered where he'd seen that gesture before, in a small medical clinic in Kenya, 20 years ago. A young medical student had done the exact same thing while reading a textbook under a tree. But before he could say anything, Grace had wished him good night and left the room. Thomas sat there surrounded by old papers, his heart racing. Was it possible? Could Grace be connected to his past in a way neither of them realized? He looked at the clock, 12:30 a.m. His questions would have to wait until morning. But as he lay in bed that night, Thomas knew he was close to solving the mystery that had been nagging him since Grace arrived. What he didn't know was that Grace had her own memories of that clinic, and of a young American businessman who had changed her life in ways she had never told anyone. The next morning, Thomas barely slept. He was up before Grace's usual 7 a.m. knock, his mind racing with possibilities. When she entered his room, he was already dressed, sitting in his wheelchair by the window. "You're up early," Grace remarked, adjusting her glasses in that familiar way that now made Thomas's heart race. "Did you sleep at all?" "Grace," Thomas said, ignoring her question, "I need your help with something important. Those boxes from last night, we need to go through them properly." Grace looked concerned. "What about your morning routine? Your exercises are important, Mr. Bennett." "This is more important," Thomas insisted. "Please." Something in his voice made Grace agree. After breakfast, they moved to the study where the boxes from 2004 were still scattered around. Thomas directed Grace to a specific box labeled Kenya Trip. "I used to do volunteer work," Thomas explained as Grace opened the box. "Before I started my company. Not many people know about it." Grace's hands hesitated for just a second as she lifted the lid, but Thomas was too excited to notice. Inside were hundreds of photographs, letters, and documents from his time in Kenya. "Look for a group photo," Thomas instructed. It would have been taken outside a medical clinic. Lots of people in it. As Grace sorted through the photos, Thomas watched her face carefully. Her professional mask was perfect, but he noticed her hands trembling slightly. "Is this what you're looking for?" she finally asked, holding up a large photograph. Her voice was steady, but her fingers gripped the photo tightly. Thomas wheeled closer, his heart pounding. The photograph showed about 30 people standing in front of a newly built clinic. He was there, 20 years younger, standing proudly with the other volunteers. But that's not what he was looking for. There, he said, pointing to the background of the photo. Under that tree. Do you see her? In the background, partially hidden by shade, sat a young woman in a white medical student's coat. She was reading a book, her hair in neat braids, and her hand was raised to adjust her glasses, the exact same gesture Thomas had come to know so well. Grace stared at the photo for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. I remember that day. It was so hot, but I had an exam the next week. I needed to study, even during the celebration. Thomas looked up at her, his eyes wide. So it is you. I knew it. I knew I'd seen you before. Grace carefully set the photo down on the desk. Yes, Mr. Bennett. That was me. I was a first-year medical student when your volunteer group built that clinic. But why didn't you say anything? Thomas asked. You must have recognized me. Grace smiled sadly. Of course I recognized you. How could I forget? That clinic changed my life. But, she hesitated. I didn't want it to affect my job here. I wanted to be hired for my skills, not because of a connection from the past. Thomas wheeled himself to his desk and pulled out another folder. There's more, he said. After we built the clinic, I started a scholarship program for medical students there. It was anonymous, but he pulled out a list of names. There, halfway down the page, was Grace Mwangi. Grace's professional composure finally cracked. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at the document. That scholarship, it paid for my last 3 years of medical school. I never knew who funded it. It was you. Thomas nodded. I wanted to help promising students become doctors. I never imagined one of them would end up saving me 20 years later. They sat in silence for a moment, both staring at the old photograph. Young Grace, studying under a tree, unaware that the American volunteer in the foreground would one day become her patient. Young Thomas, standing proudly with his volunteer group, not knowing that the dedicated medical student in the background would one day help him rebuild his life. Well, Grace finally said, wiping her eyes and straightening her glasses with that familiar gesture, this explains why your coffee order seemed familiar. You used to drink the same thing at the clinic, black with 1 sugar. Thomas laughed, and for the first time since his accident, it was a real laugh, full of joy and free of bitterness. Sometimes life had a strange way of bringing things full circle. The discovery of their shared past changed everything between Thomas and Grace. That evening, they sat in the penthouse living room, the old photograph placed on the coffee table between them. For the first time, Grace agreed to have dinner with Thomas instead of serving him and eating separately. Tell me everything, Thomas said, as they shared a meal. What happened after medical school? How did you end up here in New York? Grace took a deep breath, adjusting her glasses, the gesture that now held so much meaning for both of them. After I graduated, thanks to your scholarship, I worked at that same clinic for 12 years. I became the head doctor there. She smiled at the memory. We helped so many people. Then why did you leave? Thomas asked softly, noticing how her smile faded. The political situation in Kenya changed, Grace explained, her voice growing quiet. There was violence, protests. The clinic became a target because we treated everyone, regardless of their tribe or politics. She paused, collecting herself. One night, they burned it down. Thomas's hands gripped his wheelchair arms tightly. The clinic we built? Grace nodded. Nobody was hurt, thankfully. But after that, threats started coming. My daughter was in high school then. I couldn't risk her safety. Her voice trembled slightly. I sent her to live with my sister in another city, and I applied for a visa to America. But you were a doctor, Thomas said, with all that experience. American medical boards don't recognize most foreign medical licenses, Grace explained. To practice here, I would need to start over, new exams, new certifications, new everything. It costs more than $50,000. Thomas shook his head in disbelief. So you became a caregiver instead? I had to survive, Grace said simply. My daughter needed money for college. I couldn't sit around feeling sorry for myself. At least as a caregiver, I could still help people. Thomas wheeled himself to the window, looking out at the city lights. All these years, I've been complaining about my situation, feeling sorry for myself. But you lost everything and still kept going. Grace stood and walked over to join him by the window. Not everything, Mr. Bennett. I still have my knowledge, my experience, and my daughter. She's studying medicine now. Did you know that? She wants to be a doctor like her mother. Thomas turned to look at her. You should be practicing medicine too. It's not right that someone with your skills is pushing my wheelchair and making my coffee. There's no shame in honest work, Grace said firmly. And helping you isn't just about physical care. You needed someone to help you find your strength again. Like you found yours? Thomas asked. Grace smiled. We all need help sometimes. 20 years ago, a young American businessman helped a medical student achieve her dreams. Maybe it's time for her to return the favor. Thomas was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he said, What if you could practice medicine again, here in America? Grace shook her head. The cost, the time. I could help, Thomas said quickly. I could pay for everything, the exams, the certifications. It's the least I can do after you've helped me so much. Mr. Bennett, I can't accept that. Grace protested. It's too much. Please, Thomas said, call me Thomas. And yes, you can accept it. Think of it as an investment, just like that scholarship 20 years ago. He grinned. That one paid off pretty well, don't you think? Grace laughed, wiping away a tear. You haven't changed, you know that? You're still the same generous man who wanted to help build a clinic in Kenya. And you're still the same dedicated student I saw studying under that tree, Thomas replied. Only now, you're the one teaching me how to live again. As they sat together, looking out at the city, both felt a sense of peace. The mysterious connection that had been nagging at them finally made sense. Their lives had intersected twice, first in a small clinic in Kenya, and now in a New York penthouse. Both times, they had helped each other in ways they never expected. But this was just the beginning. Neither of them knew it yet, but their rediscovered connection would lead to something even bigger. Something that would help many more people like Grace. 2 months after discovering their shared past, Thomas's penthouse had transformed into a study center. Every evening after finishing her caregiver duties, Grace would sit at the dining table, surrounded by medical textbooks. Thomas often joined her, helping her prepare for her American medical certification exams. The human body has 206 bones, Grace recited one evening while organizing her notes. I've known this since medical school, but these American exams want everything in their specific format. Thomas watched her with admiration after a full day of taking care of him, exercises, medications, appointments. She still had the energy to study. Her dedication reminded him of the young student he'd seen in Kenya, studying under that tree. You know what I can't understand, Thomas said, wheeling closer to the table. How are you not angry? You had to leave your career, your home, everything you built. Grace looked up from her books, adjusting her glasses thoughtfully. What good would anger do? Life takes unexpected turns. Look at you. One day you're skiing, the next day everything changes. We can't control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. Her words hit Thomas hard. He had been angry since his accident, bitter about his condition. But Grace, who had lost far more, showed no bitterness at all. Tell me about your daughter, Thomas said, changing the subject. You said she's studying medicine. Grace's face lit up. Yes, Amara. She's in her 2nd year at university in Nairobi. She calls me every Sunday. She pulled out her phone and showed Thomas a photo of a beautiful young woman in a white lab coat, looking just like Grace did 20 years ago. She has your smile, Thomas observed. And your determination, I bet. And my love for glasses, Grace laughed, showing him another photo where Amara wore glasses similar to her mother's. But she's had it harder than I did. At least I had that scholarship. She paused, looking at Thomas meaningfully. Thomas cleared his throat, feeling emotional. That scholarship was one of the best investments I ever made. Look what came from it. A brilliant doctor who saved not just her patients in Kenya, but also saved me from giving up on life. Grace began to protest, but Thomas continued. No, it's true. Before you came, I was just existing. You helped me start living again. And not just with the physical therapy, you showed me that life doesn't end when bad things happen. Just then, Thomas's sister Sarah arrived for her weekly visit. She stopped in the doorway, surprised by the scene before her, the dining table covered in medical books, Thomas fully dressed and alert, engaged in conversation. Well, this is different, Sarah said, smiling. A few months ago, I could barely get you to leave your bedroom. Thomas turned to his sister. Sarah, we need to talk about something. I have an idea, and I need your help to make it happen. Grace started gathering her books. I should give you two some privacy. No, Thomas said firmly. Stay, this involves you too. He took a deep breath. I want to start a foundation for immigrant medical professionals like Grace to help them get certified in America. Sarah sat down, looking interested. Go on. Think about it, Thomas continued, his voice growing excited. There are probably hundreds of qualified doctors and nurses who come to America but can't practice. We could help them restart their careers. It would need proper organization, Sarah said, already thinking practically. Legal help, funding, connections with medical boards. We have all that, Thomas insisted. I have the money, you have the business experience, and Grace. He turned to her. You could be our first success story. Show others it's possible. Grace sat quietly, tears forming in her eyes. You would do that. Help others like me. Why not? Thomas smiled. 20 years ago, I helped build one clinic in Kenya. Now we could help build something much bigger. We could help doctors and nurses from all over the world serve their communities here. Sarah watched her brother with pride. The bitter, angry man from a few months ago was gone. In his place was the Thomas she remembered, passionate, generous, full of big ideas. Well, Sarah said, pulling out her tablet, let's start planning. What should we call this foundation? Thomas looked at Grace, then at the old photograph from Kenya that now hung on his wall. How about Full Circle Foundation? Because sometimes life brings us right back to where we need to be. Grace adjusted her glasses, smiling through her tears. Sometimes, she thought, the worst moments in life led to the most beautiful destinations. 6 months had passed since the idea of the Full Circle Foundation was born. Thomas's penthouse had become more than just a home. It was now the temporary headquarters of their growing organization. One wall of the living room was covered with photos of doctors and nurses from around the world, each with their own story of starting over in America. On this particular morning, Grace was preparing for her final medical certification exam. She stood in front of her bedroom mirror, straightening her white coat for the first time in 3 years. You look exactly like you did in that old photograph, Thomas said from her doorway, his wheelchair positioned perfectly to see her reflection. Except now you're making me feel underdressed in my t-shirt. Grace laughed, adjusting her glasses nervously. I almost forgot how it feels to wear this coat. Do you think I'm ready? Ray? Thomas wheeled himself into the room. Grace, you've been studying for months. You could probably teach these exams by now. A phone call interrupted their conversation. It was Sarah, calling with exciting news about the foundation. Turn on the news. Sarah's voice came through the speaker. Channel 7. Thomas quickly wheeled to the living room, Grace following behind. On the television, a reporter was standing outside a building with the newly installed Full Circle Foundation sign. In a groundbreaking initiative, the reporter was saying, tech billionaire Thomas Bennett has launched a foundation helping immigrant medical professionals recertify in the United States. The foundation has already received over 300 applications in its first month. The camera switched to an interview with Sarah. Our goal is simple, she explained. We have brilliant doctors and nurses coming to America, but they end up doing other jobs because they can't afford the recertification process. We're changing that. Grace sat down, overwhelmed. 300 applications? Already? Thomas nodded proudly. And that's just the beginning. We've already secured partnerships with 3 major hospitals. They're ready to hire our certified doctors and nurses. The foundation is more successful than we imagined, Grace said softly. And to think it all started because of an old photograph. Just then, Grace's phone rang. It was Amara, her daughter, calling from Kenya. Mom, Amara's excited voice filled the room as Grace put the call on speaker. I just saw the foundation's website. They're featuring your story. Why didn't you tell me it was going live today? Grace smiled. We wanted it to be a surprise. Did you read about the scholarship program? Yes, Amara exclaimed. Is it true? The foundation will help medical students from Kenya study in America. Thomas wheeled closer to the phone. Hello, Amara. Yes, it's true. We're calling it the Next Generation program. Your mother inspired it." There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Bennett? The same Mr. Bennett who built the clinic where Mom started?" "The same one," Grace confirmed. Life has a funny way of bringing people together. After talking with Amara for a few more minutes, Grace had to leave for her exam. As she gathered her things, Thomas handed her an envelope. "What's this?" she asked. "Open it after your exam," he said. "It's something I've been working on." Hours later, Grace returned to the penthouse, her face glowing with joy. "I passed," she announced as she entered. "All the exams are done." Thomas was waiting in the living room with Sarah and a small cake. "We never doubted you for a second," he said. "Now, open that envelope." Grace's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a job offer. Chief of International Medical Programs at the Full Circle Foundation, along with a position as a practicing physician at Manhattan General Hospital. "We need someone who understands both worlds," Thomas explained. "Someone who can help other doctors and nurses make the same journey you did. Who better than you?" Grace sat down, overwhelmed by emotion. "What about taking care of you?" Thomas smiled. "I think it's time I learned to take care of myself a bit more. Besides, you'll only be a few floors away at the Foundation's office." Sarah raised a glass of champagne. "To Dr. Grace Mwangi, our inspiration and our first success story." As they celebrated, Grace looked around the penthouse that had become her home. On one wall hung the photograph from Kenya that had started everything. On another were the faces of hundreds of medical professionals who would now have the same chance she had. Sometimes, she thought, life's greatest challenges led to its greatest purposes. 20 years ago, she was a student studying under a tree. Now she would help others achieve their dreams, just as Thomas had once helped her. 2 years had passed since the Full Circle Foundation began. On a bright spring morning, Thomas wheeled himself through the Foundation's bustling office building, now occupying 3 floors of a Manhattan high-rise. The walls were lined with before and after photos, immigrant medical professionals in their home countries, and then in their new American medical careers. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," called out Dr. Rodriguez, a former Venezuelan surgeon who had been one of their first success stories. She was now helping to review new applications. Thomas smiled, remembering how life had changed. His tech company still ran successfully, but this foundation had become his true passion. As he reached the main conference room, he heard familiar voices inside. "Mom, the ceremony starts in 2 hours." Amara's voice carried through the door. "You need to get ready." Thomas entered to find Amara, who had flown in from Kenya, trying to convince Grace to leave her work and prepare for the day's special event. Grace, as usual, was buried in paperwork, her glasses perched on her nose. "Your daughter is right," Thomas said. "The governor will be waiting." Grace looked up and adjusted her glasses, that same gesture that had started their incredible journey. "I just need to finish reviewing these last few applications. We have a doctor from Syria. Her story reminds me so much of mine." "Dr. Mwangi," Thomas said formally, using her professional title with a grin. "As the founder of this foundation, I order you to go get ready for your big moment." Today was a special day. The Full Circle Foundation was being recognized by the state of New York for its outstanding contribution to healthcare. In just 2 years, they had helped over 500 medical professionals restart their careers in America. 3 hours later, the Grand Hall of the New York Public Library was filled with doctors, nurses, and their families. Thomas sat in his wheelchair near the stage, Sarah beside him, both watching proudly as Grace stepped up to the podium to accept the award. 2 years ago, Grace began her speech. "I was a caregiver, my medical career seemingly over. Today, I stand before you not just as a doctor again, but as someone who has helped hundreds of others reclaim their dreams." She paused, looking at Thomas. "This foundation started because of a photograph. A picture taken 20 years ago in Kenya, where a young American volunteer helped build a clinic and a medical student studied under a tree. That volunteer and that student never imagined their paths would cross again." In the audience, Amara wiped away tears as her mother continued. "Life sometimes takes away what we love most. I lost my clinic in Kenya. Mr. Bennett lost his ability to walk. But sometimes these losses lead us to even greater purposes." Thomas looked around the room at all the faces, doctors and nurses who had come from Syria, Venezuela, Nigeria, Philippines, and dozens of other countries. Each had their own story of loss and renewal. Today, Grace continued, we have helped create 500 new beginnings. But this is just the start. Next month, we open our first training center in Chicago. By next year, we'll have centers in 5 cities. After the ceremony, there was a celebration at the foundation's office. Thomas watched as Grace moved through the crowd, talking with doctors and nurses, each greeting her with respect and gratitude. She was no longer just his caregiver. She had become a leader, a mentor, an inspiration. Amara sat down next to Thomas's wheelchair. You know, she said, Mom tells me you still won't let anyone else be your physical therapist. You could have any doctor in New York now. Thomas smiled. Your mother understands me better than any other doctor could. Besides, she still makes the best coffee, black with 1 sugar. Grace joined them, holding her award. What are you two talking about? About how some things never change, Thomas said. You still adjust your glasses the same way you did under that tree in Kenya. Grace laughed. And you're still changing lives, just like you did back then. As they looked out over the city through the office windows, all 3 felt the weight of the moment. From a small clinic in Kenya to a foundation in New York, from a medical student to a leader, from a lonely businessman to a purposeful philanthropist, their journey had been incredible. So, Amara asked, what's next? Thomas and Grace exchanged knowing looks. They had already begun planning foundation centers in Kenya, starting with rebuilding the clinic where their story began. Life they had learned truly did come full circle.